Welcome back to another episode of From the Trenches, the show where my esteemed colleague James Boyle and I bring you behind the scenes at Plan First Wealth as we build this business and work with our clients. Right, hi James.
How's it going, Rich?
It's going well, May is a little calmer than April, and I'm here for it, very here for it. April was, I think the technical term is nuts.
Yeah. Everyone has a whiplash, I think, after April. I thought, isn't the saying out like a lion and like a lamb, or opposite of that? That's supposed to be March, right? But this applied to April this year.
I don't know. But I do know it was a pretty savage month to be a financial advisor, to be a financial planner. It was one of those
to
months
be an investor,
where
too.
To be an investor, of course, yeah. Mm-hmm. Where the VIX, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, a measure of volatility, flies through the roof along with our blood pressure.
Yes. You could probably map those. I know, correlation is not causation and all that, but you could overlay blood pressure over the VIX and probably see a pretty one-to-one correlation there. I
went away for a week, spring break. I went away, I think it was like a week after Liberation Day or something. And honestly, it kind of, I wouldn't say it ruined my holiday, but it really had an impact on it because I was anxious about what was going down and I was checking the news way more than I would do normally. I'm normally pretty good at checking out on holiday.
I think I had sent you a note probably Friday at 4:59 right before your holiday, and I said, do what you can to try to tune this out and get some time with the family and, try to get some rest. And you responded, appreciate the sentiment, but I just know I'm not going to be able to.
Yeah, not even going to happen. I didn't even try.
Yeah, which is understandable, right? It was a crazy.
What we're going to talk about in a second is just the futility in that. I was checking the markets because I was anxious, but I wasn't anxious about. This is the irony, and I think you're the same. I'm not actually anxious about what's going down any more so than usual. Although it was kind of crazy. This was all so self-inflicted. I'm anxious about other people's reactions to what's going down because that's what we're managing here. And ultimately, what can I do by checking what can be achieved, and which we're going to talk about in a minute, the utter futility, the pointlessness of checking. Let's segue straight into this. Do you have any stats for us?
Well, I know you mentioned the VIX, right? So if this is not yet obvious to anyone listening, and we should say for context, we're recording this on the morning of May 8th. So there could be craziness having happened. There is
there is a UK trade deal being announced as we talk. It's on the screen in front of me.
I'm sure we'll talk about or
first of many, no doubt. First of many fantastic deals, winning deals.
The showman himself. So we talk about a month within which could have some of the most intense volatility we've seen since COVID, right? Since the worldwide pandemic. And how did we exit the month? We basically wound up flat. Now, this is not to be glib or dismissive about what an emotional roller coaster it is in the moment, in the storm, but for all that bluster and talk and fear and terror of what's coming up, so far the market is completely flat. On the month, the S&P fell less than 1%. NASDAQ actually closed up about 1%.
Oh my gosh. So let's just take a minute to digest this, because I think this is so important. In this month in which I ruined a holiday, let's not beat around the bush. There were other factors at play. My kid had an ear infection, which was nasty. But my wife has not been shy in telling me I essentially ruined this holiday. I went in a bit of a grump, and I didn't come out of this grump, and it was compounded by my kid having a bit of a nightmare as well. And I only get so many of these holidays with these kids. And then I came back, and I didn't, and she said I didn't improve much. And for what? In that month, that extremely volatile, crazy month, and who knows what's to come. It's not about trying to predict what's coming next. It's about the wider point we're making here. So much happened, and yet nothing happened. If we're just going off measuring the stock market, which is
the stock market,
which is what people, which is what we're caring about here, which is what our clients care about, is what happened to the stock market, my wealth, month on month, nothing. A huge amount, but if you'd gone to sleep on the 1st and woken up on the 30th, you'd have been like, oh, that was quiet. Not much happened then, guys.
That's a great way to put it. I think that image of if you had just, let's say you'd been away on a month-long holiday and you were in a remote outpost on an island somewhere with no internet connection, you would come back and think, oh yeah, no, that one will stick hopefully. And to your, I know you're not in need of defense of yourself, but I'm sure it's hard when you're dealing with the emotions of your clients, of investors, when you're seeing a media that is predicated upon the most attention-grabbing headlines they can muster, right? And designed in some ways to stoke that level of emotional response. It's hard to turn that off. So I can imagine how difficult it would be. And, it's as an investor, this is why we talk about zooming out, right? And now I know the one thing I'll say here, we're looking at the stock market here, obviously. The stock market is not the economy. We're not making any predictions about where things go from here. But if there's one thing you can take away from this, it's that despite an immense amount of volatility, you could wind up in the longer term fine. Now, I know that's ironic, right? Because we're looking at a month here. But like you said, you fall asleep March 31st, wake up May 1st, you would think, I guess not much happened.
It's so glib. It's so oversimplified. It's almost trite. But tune out the noise. Like, if you can do... Isn't there a... I'm going to butcher this. Isn't there a well-known study that one of the big custodians, I think Fidelity, conducted, where they looked at their many thousands of hundreds, maybe probably millions of investors, and they looked at like who did the best over time. You got active people who trade a lot, people who don't trade a lot, people who look at how often people log in. And I think you know this, I think we talked about it before, but do you know who the best performing investors were over the period of the study?
Let's let the listeners guess. We'll give it a couple seconds.
Yeah, the dead ones. I'm not joking. I'm not trying to be. I'm not being silly. Obviously, sometimes people. Well, it happens to us all. People die, and it can take a while for accounts to be sorted out. Sometimes I think it can take years. And the accounts that did the best in this study, out of all investors, were accounts where the investor had died and the account yet hadn't been sorted out. So no one had touched it. Mm-hmm. Isn't that just such a lesson?
There's many lessons in that. I've seen a similar one. I think that was the one you're referencing was either Fidelity or Vanguard. Now that I know we said Fidelity, or it might have been Vanguard. There was a similar one. They were looking at active. This was more focused on actively trading and investments, right? They sign up a bunch of people to this study. You're going to pick a bundle of stocks to start with. You can trade throughout. At the end of 6 months or a year, whatever the time period was, we'll see how everyone did. The best performing investors in that study were the ones who signed in, picked a bunch of stocks, immediately forgot their login information, couldn't be bothered to log back in, and then at the end of 12 months they're holding whatever they held, and that was that.
Well, this is why famously women are better investors than men, because women will do just that. They'll set it, forget it, or use an advisor and leave it. Whereas men, we think we possess powers that maybe we don't. Maybe we're overconfident, and we'll tinker, and a lot of the time it comes from a place of like real learning. We will really try and master this, but this isn't something that people can master, really. Yep. Warren Buffett has, but I don't think you're going to be the next Warren Buffett. So there's just so many lessons there in successful investment management, which is money investing is like a bar of soap. The less you touch it, the longer it lasts.
Perfect. Speaking of Buffett too, he just obviously announced he's stepping down at the end of the year. I should have pulled the exact quote, but he had some really good pull quotes from his most recent. It was a collection of shareholders meetings in this exact vein, essentially saying, look, I don't know what the headline is going to be tomorrow, next week, and next month. And quite frankly, I don't care. It's about when you're investing in stocks, when you're investing in equities, it's about not only removing the emotional element to the extent you can. We know it's impossible to do that completely, right? But to the extent you can, not letting emotions, not letting reactivity drive those decisions. That is the most critical point to success in long-term stock investing. And there's no way around it.
I hope May's a bit calmer.
Me too.
Obviously, the 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days, the 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the end of May, early June. 90 days will expire, I think, at the Oh, I hope we don't have a repeat of what we've had so far. It's based in it's 20 years of experience, 20 years of learning. This is how you make money in the markets.
Speaking of that, we're in this lull, right? If you can call it that. Things have quieted a bit, as we've talked about. Obviously, there's still a ton of uncertainty around tariffs. Not going to get into the specifics there, but the 90 days ends July 8th, just for everyone listening. What I've found interesting this week, because the Fed met yesterday, decided to hold rates steady, odds of a cut in June have actually come down pretty substantially as well. They're sitting at about 20% right now. And the thought process, I think, I don't want to put words in the Fed's mouth, but it's almost like, why would you cut a month before this timer goes off, right? And we have more clarity. That might sound like a joke for some, but
the fear we'll
see what happens.
The fear is what damage has been done now.
Yeah,
great. It seems that he's working towards these deals. Whether they're good or bad remains to be seen. But what damage is done in the meantime?
And what hands are being tied, right? And by that I mean the Fed is in a very sticky situation right now where they need to. They're dealing with this massive question mark of what does tax trade policy look like going forward? What does it look like on July 9th, right? And then who knows what comes after that? But also checking and sort of warily, I'm sure, checking for weakness in the jobs market, which we haven't seen quite yet, but you could argue that the numbers don't reflect yet all the uncertainty with trade taxes. So we'll see.
If you're a long-term, diversified investor, these periods are not fun. They are still scary, but you have to tune them out.
Yep.
Trade at your peril. We
talk a lot about recessions, right? That becomes the new sort of bell that everyone's ringing, right? Are we going to see a slowdown this year? And, we've talked till we're blue in the face about not trying to time the market in general, certainly not trying to time when a recession is going to happen, if it does, and the severity of it. All I'll point back to, and I know we've brought this up many times, 2022, I was just reading an article that had a collection of all the headlines in 2022, later part of 22, after what was a pretty challenging year, especially if you were holding a mixed allocation, right? Stocks and fixed income both had a really challenging.
It was rough. It was really rough.
It was rough. Yeah. Yep.
It was a grind.
It was a grind, a slow grind down throughout a year. And no safety, right? It didn't feel like, well, my stocks are down, so fixed income's up. We didn't see that, obviously. Every single pundit, every analyst, every bank was calling for a certain recession starting early part of 2023. Now, if you had taken those warnings as gospel and you had sold out or made the wrong decision trying to be reactive to something that you couldn't predict, you would miss out on what is still a 60, 65, 70% run in the S&P since then. I mean, we're sitting down 8% from all-time highs right now. Again, zero prediction about what's going to happen, but think about all the noise that you as an investor, if you're listening, you survived in April. You have the fortitude to do it. Hopefully everyone did that's listening. And you can do it again no matter what kind of uncertainty.
Oh, James, hopefully everyone listening did, but everyone in the world definitely didn't. Did you see we were sending them around. There were Wall Street Journal articles, there were New York Times articles about saying investors are capitulating. These investors held on through COVID, but they're abandoning ship now. People wrecked their financial futures again every single time it happens. 2020, It was the COVID people who thought the world was ending because of COVID. They may have sat through this, but this time, I think politics comes into it, obviously. They're convinced that the sky is going to end the world order as we know it.
Your relationship with your money, I know this is also something we talk about, but your relationship with your money changes as your time horizon changes, as your life changes. So if you're approaching retirement, talk very often about how when selling feels the best, it's the most dangerous, right? Yes. So if you join me on this strenuous metaphor here, that also applies to your life cycle, so to speak, your investor life cycle, that when you feel like you need to sell or when you are most vulnerable to those kind of impulses, usually for an investor is right in or right after retiring, which can really have long-term detrimental. You could blow up what would have been a successful retirement by one mistake.
You know what's been useful this time? Because you're absolutely bang on there. What's been useful this time compared to 2022 is the diversification has worked. So you're able to say, yes, this part of your portfolio is hurting, but this, your international stuff's not. In fact, it's doing pretty well. Oh, and also if we look at your fixed income exposure, that's holding its own quite well as well. So that has been helpful to be able to reframe the thinking, because we're all so dominated by America, fairly and unfairly. But diversification has absolutely helped these conversations this time.
Absolutely. It's one of those things they say, in an up market, when things are going well, diversification means always having to say you're sorry, right? People look at S&P 500 or the Mag 7 and say, why aren't we invested in that fully? It's in a down market. It's in an environment like this of uncertainty and investors' fear and doubts creeping in, that all of a sudden you see the benefits of diversification. You think, I'm glad I'm globally diversified. I'm glad I have some fixed income. I'm glad I have X, Y, Z, right? Whatever those tools are.
This is why it's so important to get your asset allocation right, particularly going into retirement, because this is going to happen. And when it does, you need to know that you're positioned appropriately for it. And that's why it's absolutely critical.
And a part of that, maybe a sort of adjacent idea or pillar there, is income planning, right? Knowing, okay, let's say we do have some uncertainty. Let's say we go into a recession and there is weakness in the latter half of the year. Where is my income coming from? Do I understand where I'm pulling from? Am I doing it in a tax efficient manner? Is there any opportunity here for things like tax loss harvesting, rebalancing that I know we've talked about, tax coordination between accounts? Am I utilizing all the tools available at my disposal, or is my advisor doing that, so that I can feel confident even in an environment like this where obviously fear, doubt, uncertainty is trending high, potentially trending higher.
So I had Brian Dunhill, the Brian Dunhill of the famous Dunhill Financial on the podcast last week. We were talking about PFIX, the scourge. Have I said that right? The scourge of
you're
any US connected
guy for
any US connected expat globally, but we see it with Brits all the time with their in their ISAs or in their GIAs. Non-US investments as a US person become very, very costly, both literally in terms of taxes and possible penalties, but taxes, interest, and reporting requirements, and quite possibly having to go back and fix some reporting non-compliance as a result of having the non-US investments. We see what would you reckon? I reckon still the most common mistake is probably not reporting missing off assets from informational returns. Even if there are informational returns, FBARs being submitted, some forms might be missed, and/or some accounts might be missed off the FBARs and stuff. I still think that's the number one problem. I'm interested to know what you think. But number two, very, very closely behind this, is PFIX.
I would agree 100%. The non-reporting is pervasive to the point of almost 100% of the cases we talk to, or people we work with, there is something missing. Now, if you have a good tax team in place, then those are the cases. If someone is coming to us already with a good cross-border US-UK qualified tax advisor in place, then they're probably in compliance, and that's great. But non-reporting is super, super common, and there is a tendency of defensiveness of saying, oh, I have this pension, but I haven't taken any money out. I don't need to report that. Well, we've talked about it in the past. It's not the case. Second, with a bullet, PFIX. Foreign investments that do not play nice in the U.S. I was appreciative. Of course, we love what Dunhill does. We look up to them as a firm helping Americans abroad, and I was happy to see and hear Brian talk through PFIX and be unequivocal. Obviously, there's always nuance to these things, but almost across the board, PFIX are just an area that you absolutely want to avoid, right? If you have them,
all the time,
take steps to get rid of them. And if you don't have them, make sure you know what the rules are so that you don't, unwittingly walk into a trap like that.
And it's particularly brutal with ISAs, because people come here with ISAs. They're not sure they're going to stay forever, and you don't want to give up an ISA. It's like having a Roth. It's a really great benefit. So they maintain their ISAs, and little do they know, as soon as they step on American soil, they've gone from having a highly tax efficient account to having a highly tax inefficient account. It's not just taxed at capital gains rates; it's going to be taxed at PFIC rates, which are much, much, much higher. Back of an envelope, I just use 50% as a starting point, especially if state tax is involved. maybe a little bit less, but I would just start 50% on any gains. And then if they've had it for a while, they're going to be in some form of non-compliance. So you've got a historic problem. So they've gone from having this super regular, super mainstream, tax-efficient vehicle to, oh, by the way, it's not only is it not tax-free now, it's punitively taxed. Oh, and by the way, you've also got a compliance problem that you might want to sort out. It might cost a lot to sort out. It's a double whammy. It's horrible.
It's a massive headache. It's certainly not welcome news when, someone is like you say, certainly was using the vehicle as it was designed and had very valid reasons to doing that. It's just that unfortunately by the U.S.'s idiosyncratic rules, they're not good, and in fact they can cause massive headaches. I'm hesitant to share too much in the way of specific cases, but what we find now, we're putting out a lot of content, right? Across all different channels, podcasts, YouTube. We are getting a lot of interest from investors earlier on in their careers, earlier on in their time spent in the U.S. I find that these types of investors, almost to a one, have an ISA that is invested. And I think that is because the ISA, you're probably more familiar with the history than I am, but a fairly newer account type, similar to a Roth in the States. It takes some time. Generally, there's a life cycle to these things. It takes some time to get people active and using them and opening them and investing in them. The younger someone is, in my experience, the more likely it is that they have an ISA, and the more likely it is that they're investing in that ISA. And unfortunately, it's something that the good thing is if they've only been here a year or two, okay, well then maybe the damage is limited and we can address it and fix it, and it's not too much of a headache to get out of it. But the bad news is it is an issue, right? And it needs to be addressed.
It's still brutal. I know someone who had a substantial amount in an ISA, and he's not been here long. And he moved here with the ISA, and he went from being tax-free to being punitively taxed. It's cost him tens of thousands of dollars that would have been avoided had he liquidated before he came. And that is a real bitter pill to swallow. Do you know something I'm surprised about? The amount of times people listening to this podcast, which is great, and we love that, so please keep listening to people. And then sometimes people will reach out to us and inquire about how we can help. And I've been surprised by the amount of people who have definitely listened to the podcast, but then who have got some of the landmines. I'm specifically thinking about PFIX that we talk about, but who it hasn't clicked that what we're talking about now is lurking in their affairs. Mm-hmm. Everyone wasn't expecting that. I thought people would be listening to this going, oh, that's me. Oh, dear, I need to fix this. And that's not the case.
Now, we should say there's going to be episodes that people pick and choose, right? The things that look interesting.
Of course.
Certainly, if you're listening, if you're a bi-weekly listener in every episode, we appreciate that. We love that. Part of what makes these things so complex, and I think part of the reaction that you see and that we see in that vein, is that I think as humans we tend to we sort of glom onto one idea, and there's information overload, right? So if they happen to get past a link to a podcast talking about the exit tax or PFIX or non-reporting, I think that sticks in someone's head, and it might prompt them to reach out, right? Have a conversation with us or send an email and say, hey, I'm thinking about this, this, and this. It is only through a qualified advisor, right? Whether it's us or someone else, we think we do a pretty good job, but it takes someone who is steeped in this industry, who has worked through these opportunities, worked through these landmines, had these conversations day in and day out for years on end to really understand how all the puzzle pieces fit together. Because I think otherwise it is so easy, to your point, to either miss them completely, right? To just walk by them and kind of have no idea, right? Complete ignorance, not a judgment on anyone's demeanor, but that's very common. Or maybe more insidiously, someone who says, oh, you know what? I heard that clip on LinkedIn about exit tax, and that's something I wasn't aware of. I'm worried about that. Can we have a conversation? The challenging part in our position is sometimes then having the broader conversation of, okay, yes, that is an area of concern, and we want to make sure we can help you navigate that. But also, you need to be thinking about X, Y, and Z, and here's a list of those things that you really should consider. You're right. It's unfortunate, and sometimes those conversations are challenging because it's not always good news. But in some sense, we're thankful that the person has found someone who can help, right? Or had reached out to a tax advisor who referred them to us, or an estate planner who referred them to us.
Yeah. I'd also say the amount of times the people we encounter who have got these problems, who have got a wealth manager or a financial planner, and have had for decades, and this festering problem, which only gets worse as time goes on because of interest, has just been left to grow and metastasize. This cross-border world is so specialized. They have no idea. I have no idea about trust reporting for you. Didn't before you joined, right?
I was just going to say, everyone, if you've heard everyone listening has heard my voice on these things, maybe, but obviously I'm American. I came up on the American financial planning side, was a U.S. CPA in the U.S. If I had come across someone with a foreign account, and I probably have, honestly, in 10 years of doing this, it was just, we can't help you with that, and you're going to have to address that separately. And that was truly the end of the conversation, right? Because you just don't have the expertise. But
James, here's the point, right? Best case scenario for the client, that's an opportunity cost. You're aware, they're aware. There's something you can't advise on, you can't help here, and that's just abandoned. We see this with UK pensions all the time. It's just abandoned. Okay. Best case scenario, there's an opportunity cost to not dealing with that now. Worst case scenario, and in fact more common, is you've actually detonated a landmine. Or you've identified a landmine but not dealing with it because maybe that account that you've just said, I can't help with that, is PFIX. And that gets worse and worse and worse over time. Or maybe it's a foreign pension and it should be reported on all these different forms and it's not. And that has compliance issues or statute limitations issues. So best case scenario there, opportunity cost. More common, it's worse.
Yep. And part of that, this is good because we're really getting into kind of the business side of things, right? Part of the areas I think we want to expand, and we had the conversation recently with a fellow advisory group. Part of that is advisor education, right? Is trying to get the word out, and part of that is this podcast and our YouTube and our LinkedIn and all the content we produced, trying to let not only investors but also other advisors understand that you can't just turn a blind eye to these things. There are problems there. There be dragons, right? As a U.S.-based advisor working with U.S. people, they are not going to have the first clue. I certainly would have, that this could cause an issue.
James, we have planned for this podcast, which I won't go into now, but we have some plans to expand on this. I have an inclination, I have a feeling that it might end up, our advisor audience might end up eclipsing our expat audience. Because I think more and more advisors are waking up to this. That and the good work of the GFPI, the Global Financial Planning Institute, in promoting this as a niche that demands rigorous education and training. As these things expand and as advisors become more and more aware of the need to have a effective niche for themselves, I think they're going to seek out information sources, and I know we have a lot of advisors listening already, and I think as we expand this show, we might even end up with more. And I'm totally down with that. That would be a great outcome as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely, because in some ways, the existing advisors or domestic advisors can be a conduit, right, to get this information across to more people at once. Now, when investors find us and hear our content and listen to us and know what we're all about, that's great. But we want to get this message out as widely, as comprehensively, and the sooner the better, right? Because there are so many expats, so many immigrants in the States that just don't know, not for any fault of their own, but because the U.S. is such a bizarre system. And that's me being as friendly as possible in my home country as I can. But, that these rules exist and there are these landmines that just no one, many times, just don't know about or just aren't aware of. Yeah.
Yep. Amen. Okay, did you have something to share regarding Social Security?
That I was going to have something to share. That turned out to be a misunderstanding, but just for everyone's, it's worth touching on. I know we mentioned it in the past. Windfall elimination provision was a part of the Social Security Code that essentially meant you could suffer a reduction in your Social Security benefit because you're eligible for a foreign state pension. That was repealed in December of last year. It was retroactive to January of last year. So if you're collecting Social Security, if you've been collecting it throughout 2024, you will be eligible for a lump sum of those essentially back paid benefits. The Social Security Administration has said those would start being rolled out in April of this year. We thought we might have had a case where our client actually received it. I haven't heard of that yet. That was a misunderstanding. But if anyone listening has received their lump sum, their back pay from Social Security from WEP, certainly reach out and let us know. I'd be really interested to hear the form it came in. I'm sure it gets direct deposited or however you receive your benefit. And I'd be interested to hear the timing. I'm curious how they're going about who gets these things quicker. There's all kinds of language on the SSA.gov website, all kinds of caveats about more complex plans or more complex benefit situations will require further study, so it'll take more time. So curious to see how that rollout comes through.
That must be a massive logistical
job.
That huge. Yeah. At a time when the government's not, it's very quiet in the government, I believe. It's not like there's someone rampaging through with his chainsaw. So that must have been perfect timing for
Perfect timing, yeah.
Joe, should we just say next on the podcast as well, we were talking then about all the issues with PFIX and compliance, and I think quite timely then we have Dan Price on the podcast next. Dan is a attorney, a tax attorney in Texas. But prior to that, he spent over 20 years at the IRS in the Office of the Chief Counsel, and he was involved in designing, building, and monitoring some of these compliance programs, specifically the Streamline program, which is the one we're most familiar with, and I think we spend most of our time talking about. So he is, in so many respects, he is just the perfect person to come on and talk about this. He was designed in the implementation of the scheme. He was designed in the monitoring of the scheme. He has seen all sorts of submissions, good, bad, and ugly. Perfect person to come on and talk about if you find yourself in non-compliance and you want to take proactive steps to come into compliance for international or offshore reasons. This is how you do it. Perfect person to have on. And PFIX and reporting and all this stuff we talk about on the show all the time. This is offshore non-compliance.
That is both. If you haven't listened to Brian Dunhill's the last episode in the feed, definitely go ahead and listen to that. Dan Price, I also consider an absolute must listen. We had I won't step on toes, or I don't want to spoil anything, quote unquote, but we had a conversation with Dan a couple of weeks back about a specific issue. And just hearing him talk from a perspective of having been in that seat, right, is so incredibly informative and illuminating about what the processes are, what the mindsets are, what the, how it actually unfolds these things. So absolutely, if you're an expat in the States. Listen.
Chris McElmore, Virginia La Torre Yeager, Dan Price, we have some serious tax attorneys on the show hitters. talking about important stuff. I'm really proud of some of the content we're putting out. Okay.
I know we have we were chomping at the bit to talk about this. I saw a movie in theaters recently that I thought was one of the best theatrical experiences I've had in I would say years. A movie called Sinners by director Ryan Coogler. I don't want to step on your toes. You had a very different opinion.
I hated it. And I didn't want to. I was with my wife and she loved it, and we would normally get on with it. We normally agree with this stuff. I had to Reddit it halfway through to see if I was the only person in the world who thought, because it's mega hyped.
It's huge. Yeah.
And I just thought it was, and I love Black Panther, love Michael B. Jordan, right? I went into this thinking, I love, can I do a spoiler?
I was going to say,
Dusk Till Dawn.
I think that's enough. As long as it's
okay.
Not.
So Dusk Till Dawn, another movie from the late 90s or mid 90s maybe even, which is kind of normal, then goes a bit nuts with vampires. That kind of love that movie. Went in thinking I was going to love this and hated it. Frankly, hated
that's
it.
A shame.
The first half, it was just so slow. It felt like. It just felt over stylized. It felt over style over substance. I did not like it. I did not get it. I did not enjoy it. The story was kind of, for me, non-existent. And I know it was making a point about ownership and stuff, but it just, and racism, it just didn't do it for me. It didn't do it for me. To the point where it got me quite angry.
Everyone has those things that we talked about. There's always pop culture zeitgeist things that just don't land, right? I'm sorry to hear.
Are you calling me old?
No. There's always things that people rave about that you just don't get. It landed for me. I'll say this, and I won't spoil anything, but there is a scene, and it is arguably a slow start, right? I think it's about halfway through, 60% through the movie.
Interminably
This scene, I'll just tell you, I was basically hovering in the theater. If I think I could say it's around music. Sort of talks about the interconnectivity. No, not the jig. I mean, I enjoyed that too, but the other one with the inside, I'll say. But now we're getting into
no.
And I'll say if that doesn't land,
they'd already lost me at that point.
Yeah. And if that didn't help, then you're not gonna.
I respect what they were trying to do there, but I didn't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really didn't do it for me. What are you reading at the moment?
Oh, that's a good question. I did read. What can I share? A new fiction book I'm in the middle of. My gosh,
what do you read?
Oh, it's I don't want to dive. We tend to stay pretty neutral politically, so I've been reading some nonfiction that I think could be misinterpreted.
You've piqued my interest there. I'll have to watch you offline.
Maybe a future episode I'll dive into it. But it's an author called Charlotte McConaughey. I want to make sure I get that right. She wrote a book. She deals with sort of climate change in a fictional setting, usually near future, very near future, and looking at it through the lens of, fallout of a changing climate and what does that look like and how does society adapt and what can we do. The book is called Wild Dark Shore. I think it came out either earlier this year or late last year, and her name is Charlotte McConaughey. Set on a remote island, it's sort of a contained mystery. There's a woman washes up on shore, and we don't know where she's coming from. There's a family living on the island, and there's people maybe missing and trying to figure out what's going on. So I've been really beautifully written. So I've been enjoying that. I haven't finished it yet.
I'm still on the Silk Road. You should read. It's a big one. It's a good one. Normally, when I read nonfiction, it's kind of like a biography, or it's set very much in a point in time, a lifespan, and sometimes it goes to parents beforehand, and maybe even a bit earlier. But generally, it's one or two generations. Whereas this book spans like a couple of millennia. It's been very interesting, actually.
I've heard that's really good.
Yeah, really, really good. I've been reading about things I would never have read about, like reading about the Mongols and Attila the Hun before that. Probably would never have read a book about those, honestly. So yeah, I would recommend this book to, frankly, everyone. Nice. So I think it's just like a really important book on how the world and trade developed, looking beyond the Athens, Rome, Middle Ages, Renaissance.
The kind of highlights
I think
that you get.
We all tend to focus on. There's much more at play than that. It was much more interconnected much earlier on than I think any of us really realised or think about. So globalisation isn't going away anytime soon. Let's put it that way.
No, it's not a new idea either, right?
Yeah.
I have one more shout out. David Attenborough turns 99 today, as of recording.
Legend.
Yes, absolute legend.
Absolute
so happy birthday
legend.
to the man himself.
That term's overused, but he is truly a legend. Like I'm of probably many generations of Brits who his voice is just nature programs aren't quite the same when it's not narrated by David Attenborough.
Agreed.
They can be great,
completely.
But they never can be quite as good.
Yep. A national treasure. That's a UK term, right?
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I think his health is pretty good. Seems like it's amazing that he's 99. Happy birthday to him. I think, like you said, just a body of work that's hard to sum up, but such an important voice over decades and decades and decades through his work. Yeah. So,
his brother was a famous actor.
He was the would you call him the bad guy in Jurassic Park?
Let's call him the grandfather.
The grandfather.
Is he the grandfather?
I think he was. Yeah, I think he was related. Yeah. The bad guy was, I guess, the Raptors, right?
Yes. Yeah. Look at you scapegoating the poor Raptors.
Yeah. He was great too. He's great in that. Was he Richard Attenborough?
Richard Attenborough. Yeah. Is Philly on fire? Someone kicking off outside you. Yeah, of course. Philly.
I'm sure there's a fist fight outside.
Philly's at the Philly anthem.
Come and knock on the door soon.
Okay. All right, mate. Good to chat with you as always. I will see you. I'll see you in a month's time. If I don't see you before then, I hope I do, seeing as we work together very closely.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I know we don't always say this, but if you are enjoying the podcast, make sure you follow us wherever you're listening. Get in touch. Certainly, all the emails come back to us directly. We're happy to answer any questions you have or have a conversation about the topics we cover. And if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. It really helps with the algorithms, which are all important, as we know. Thanks again.